Author's note: We never anticipated we would write a second book about Donald Trump's time in the White House. Our first, a very stable genius, brought readers deep inside his chaotic and impulsive presidency. Our story ended as Trump was about to face impeachment for pressuring a foreign country to investigating his political rival, well into his third year. We expected his presidency would follow its established pattern and rhythm. Then came the year 2020, Trump's final year in office turned out to be by far his most consequential, and for many Americans, the most frightening. We felt compelled to pick up where we left off, our mind raced with questions anew. We felt a responsibility for history to reveal what was happening behind the scenes as Trump stared down his first true crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, and chose to spawn another, the subversion of democracy, an act that led him to be the first US president ever to be twice impeached. This book is based on hundreds of hours of interviews with more than 140 sources, including the senior-most Trump administration officials, career government officials, friends, and outside advisors to the 50 presidents, as well as other witnesses to the event described herein. Some of our interviews with key figures extended for more than 5 hours in a single sitting, as the sources recounted their experience in meticulous detail. Most of the people we interviewed agreed to speak candidly only on the condition of anonymity, to share private account moments that profoundly challenged or shocked them, to protect their future career, or to fend off relation from Trump or his ally. Many of them provide their account in a background capacity, meaning we were permitted to use the information they shared so long as we protected their identity and did not attribute detail to them by name. A few of our sources agreed to speak on the record, including Trump, whom we interviewed for 2.5 hours. We are objective journalists who seek to share the truth with the public. In this book, we aim to provide the closest version of the truth that we could determine based on rigorous reporting. We carefully reconstructed scenes to present Trump unfiltered, showing him in action rather than telling readers what to think of him. These scenes were reconstructed based on first-hand account and, whenever possible, corroborated by multiple sources and buttressed by our review of calendars, diary entries, slideshow decks, internal memos, and other correspondence among principals. Dialogue cannot always be exact, but is based here on people's memory of events and, in some cases, contemporaneous notes taken by witnesses. In a few instances, sources disagree substantively about the facts in an episode, and when necessary, we note that in the page. Recognize that different narrators sometimes remember events differently. This book is an outgrowth of our reporting for the Washington Post. As such, some of the detail in our narrative first appear in stories we authored for the newspaper, some of them in collaboration with other colleagues. However, the overwhelming majority of the scene, dialogue, and quotation are original to our book and based on the extensive reporting we conducted exclusively for this project. To reconstruct episodes that played out in public, we relied upon video of events, such as presidential speeches, many of which are archived on C-SPAN's website. We also relied on contemporaneous news reports in the Post as well as in other publications. We have also drawn from the government record, including internal government reports and private email exchanges. In most instances, we built upon the published record with our own original reporting. Material gleaned from such accounts is probably attributed either with direct reference in the chapter text or in the endnote. Prologue. On January 20, 2017, Donald John Trump became president, unskilled in the machinery of government and unmoved morally by the calling of the position, but aglow in his unmatched power. The first 3 years of Trump's term revealed a presidency of one in which the universal value was loyalty, not to the country, but to the president himself. Scandal, bluster, and uninhibited chaos resigned. Decisions were driven by reflexive logic of self-preservation and self-aggrandizement. Delusion-born narcissism and insecurity overtook reality. In those early years, which are chronicled in the book of Barrister Virginia, Trump's adversaries believed his ego and pride prevented him from making sound, well-informed judgment. His management style resembled carnival life, striking this way and that, forcing senior government officials to throw his in-hand and sometimes illegal ideas. Some of them concluded that the president was a long-term and immediately danger to the country that he had sworn oath to protect, yet they took a comfort that he had not had a steer to the country through a true crisis. Trump's action had words, nevertheless had painful consequences. His assault on the rule of the law degraded our democratic institutions and left Americans literally fearful they could no longer take a granted basis civil life and untainted justice. His contempt for foreign alliance weakened American leadership in the world and empowered dictators and despots. His barbarous immigration enforcement ripped migrant children out of the arms of their families. His bigoted rhetoric involved white supremacists to step out of the shadow. But at least Trump had not been faced by a foreign military strike, an economic collapse, or a public health crisis. At least not until 2020. This book chronicles Trump's catastrophic fourth and final year as president. The year 2020 will be remembered in the American epoch as one of anger and abject failure. The coronavirus pandemic killed more than 500,000 people in the United States and infected tens of millions more. The deadliest health crisis in a century. Through the administration Operation Warp Speed helped produce vaccine in record time. Its overall coronavirus response was mismanaged by the president and marred by turpitude and backbiting. The virus was only one of the crises Trump confronted in 2020. The pandemic paralyzed the economy, plunging the nation into recession during which low-wage workers, many of them minorities, suffered the most. The May 25th killing of George Floyd, a black man, under the knee of the white police officer in Minneapolis ignited protests for racial justice and an end to police discrimination and brutality. Yet Trump sought to exploit the simmering divisions for personal political gain, quickly declaring himself a president of law and order, and relentlessly pressuring Pentagon leaders to deploy active duty troops against Black Lives Matter protesters. The worsening crime crisis, meanwhile, was almost entirely ignored by Trump, who earlier in his term had rolled back environment regulation and withdrawn the United States from the Paris Agreement. The president was instead preoccupied with talking up about the legitimacy of the election. After he lost to Joe Biden, Trump fanned the flame of conspiracies and heard about fraud that did not exist. His first crime of election inspired thousands of people to storm the Capitol in a violent and ultimately failed insurrection. On January 6, 2021, the year 2020 tested the Republic. Yet the institution designed by the founding fathers were still standing by the time Trump left office. American democracy withstood the unrelenting assault of this president. Trump cried summoned tens of thousands of angry citizens to Washington to overturn the election, but Vice President Mike Pence and scores of lawmakers followed their constitutional duty. There is a good news story here. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, told the military brass at the conclusion of Trump's presidency, "It's a strength of the country. There is a polarization, but at the end of the day, the country did stand tall. There was a peaceful transfer of power. There weren't tanks in the street, and the line bent, but it didn't break." Senator Mitt Romney, who often stood alone among fellow Republicans in criticism of Trump, said the president's attack on democratic institutions amounts to one of the great failures of any president. "I think as we all recognize, democracy is more than taking a vote," Romney said. "We've had a number of countries take votes too quickly fall into despair from democratic standpoint, in part because they don't have any institutions that allow democracy to survive. Attacking the institution here put democracy itself in jeopardy, whether it's our judicial system, our freedom of the press, our intelligence community, the FBI. These things underpin the strength of a democratic republic. So he attacked those along the way, and then at final act, attack election integrity itself. Those things have real consequences. The character of Trump's leadership blazingly evident through the first 3 years of his presidency had deadly ramifications in his final year. He displayed his ignorance, his rash temper, his pettiness and pique, his malice and cruelty, his utter absence of empathy, his narcissism, his transgressive personality, his disloyalty, his sense of victimhood, his addiction to television, his suspicion and silencing of experts, and his deception and lie. Each trait thwarted the response of the world's most powerful nation to a lesser threat. The last year, you see what happens when you actually have erosion in the capacity of government to respond. When you have presidents and appointees who don't take governance serious and honestly don't know how to use it, said Margaret O'Mara, a professor of history at the University of Washington. That's the great tragedy. It shows how fundamental oblivious the president was to governing and immense power for good his disposal. Most of Trump's falling can be explained by a simple truth. He cared more about himself than the country, whether managing the coronavirus or addressing racial unrest or reacting to his election defeat. Trump prioritized what he thought to be his political and personal interests over the common good. There come moments where you have to decide, am I going to do something that purely on my own self-interest if it is contrary to the interests of the people I represent? One of Trump's outburst remarks. And in those moments, you've always got to pick the people you represent. The fact is that 2020 Donald Trump put himself ahead of the country. When you do that as a leader, the people notice, and when they notice, they kick your ass out. Throughout his presidency, Trump cast himself as a long-suffering, tormented victim. He believed himself to be persecuted by what he called the deep state, a reference to any number of nation security, intelligence, and law enforcement officials. Because some of these officials investigated his campaign contract with Russian operators amid Russian effort to help Trump win in 2016, he saw them as enemies. He branded any investigation pertaining to his conduct, whether it was Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 campaign, probe into the finance or an impeachment inquiry to the he pressured on crime to help him smear Biden a witch hunt. He also claimed the media were running a sophisticated disinformation operation to puncture his popularity, and he immediately apologized for criticism and right. Trump instead insists complaining then counter to what had long been core tenet of the Republican Party, personal responsibility. Yet Trump's strategy of self-victimization yoked him to his supporters, who similarly felt disapproved by illegally Washington and felt wronged by the fast-changing global economy. Trump sent toolkit for getting out of trouble, bullying, bluster, and manipulation was usually seen managing the pandemic. He tried to cloak reality with happy talk. He promised cure that would never be realized. He floated dangerous and unproven treatment, such as injecting bleach into patients' bodies. He murdered experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who challenged his shaking claim and became more popular than the president. He refused to lead by example and wear a mask. He picketed with health officials and state governments scrambling to be reformed to emergency outbreaks, striking out those who didn't praise his appropriate response. Not only did he fail to keep America safe, he couldn't even keep himself safe. Trump was hospitalized with COVID-19 in October 2020, zapping his false air of invincibility. The coronavirus changed the world, altering how people work, how families lived, and what constitutes community. These profound changes were accelerated by the recession and heightened by the tension in the aftermath of Floyd killing. Trump, however, principally governed for a minority of the country, his hardcore political supporters, and chose neither to try to unite the nation nor to reimagine a post-pandemic America. He acted on the anger and dissatisfaction among many white people who felt economically threatened and culturally marginalized. He pit groups of Americans against one another. He uttered racial slurs and used his emergent social media platform to spread messages of hate. He stoked fear and acted on violence. His view of America is provincial, it's parochial, it's solid, it's any other adjective that calls up sense of narrowness and ugliness, said Eric Rhodes Jr., chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. In so many ways, Donald Trump represents the death letter of old America, and it's loud and it's violent. A senior government official who worked closely with the president drew a parallel between Trump's handling of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Nazi Germany. People either secretly or the crowd are interested in personal survival and stability and safety, the official said. When you are experiencing confusion and chaos and things you can't quite make sense of, and you see this phenomena around you that's getting scary, the economy and COVID and losing your job and immigrants crossing the border, along comes a guy who takes fuel, throwing on the fire and make you scared shitless. I will protect you. That's what Hitler did to consolidate power in 1933. Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic House Speaker whose opposition to Trump was the resolute as any twice preceded over his impeachment in 2019 for seeking help from Ukraine in his re-election, and 2021 for instigating the Capitol's election after he left office. She told us in interview that she was grateful democracy had prevailed but feared another president might come along and pick up where Trump left off. We might get somebody of his ilk who's sane, and that would really be dangerous, because he could be somebody who's smart, who's strategic, and the rest. Percy said, "This is slow. He doesn't believe in science. He doesn't believe in governance. He's snake oil salesman, and his shirt. Give him credit for his shrewdness. The shrewdness, corporationist, and unnatural political stamina allowed Trump to deliver on many of his campaign promises. He pleased his conservative base by remarking the federal judiciary, including with three nominations to the Supreme Court, cutting Texas corporation and the wealthy, expanding the military, turning border enforcement and weakening the regulatory state. Trump also forced new bilateral trade agreements, negotiated peace accords in the Middle East, and won concession from European allies he had argued were taking advantage of the United States. Trump nearly won second term. More than 74 million people voted to re-elect him, the second highest voter total ever recorded, the higher being Biden 81 million. Were it not for Biden victories in a handful of swing states, Trump would have won electoral college and secured 4 more years in office. It would be foolhardy then to dismiss his presidency as a failure and to turn the page on this period. Rather, we must try to understand what made him appealing to so many and what the reveal about the country. Trump almost certainly would have achieved more had he governed effectively and nurtured a professional and productive work culture. Instead, he allowed his White House to become a nest of vipers, with senior officials often advancing their personal agendas and abandoned instead of a collective mission. It was by far the most toxic environment I could imagine working in, and I'm not a fragile person, a senior White House official recalled. People were deeply cruel to each other. By his 4 years in office, Trump had surrounded himself as much as he could with influence and loyal patrons. Power in the West Wing consolidated around the Jacques the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, and Mark Meadows, a White House chief of staff who prioritized campaign politics and believed it was his duty to execute the president's wishes, where the others on cabinet secretary them. They are supposed to be the White House advisor to the president. That's a big part of the story of the administration. The people he has around him are pouring things in his ear, but they aren't giving him careful through advice. There are no others. A few story guardrails remained. Merely defensive secretary Mark Esper and attorney Bill Barr were there when the president wanted to deploy the military to American cities. Barr, despite loyally looking out for the president, instance at the Justice Department, also offended of some of his efforts to prosecute and punish his enemies. The leader of Federal Health Agency prevented Trump from conducting the coronavirus vaccine development by rushing approval before Election Day. And then there was Pence, who certified Biden Electoral College victory after 4 years of unflinching visits to Trump, even though almost everybody who worked with Trump ended up taking a lot of grief and having reputationally scandalous of it. There was a number of good people who tried to prevent the worst at the White House over the year, said the senior Republican lawmaker. Crowned in one camp and people genuinely trying to prevent the worst in the world other camp. There were some here or there, good people at key moments, telling a lesson that the system is more important than anybody, including the president. This lawmaker added. These are conclusions drawn from our 4 years of reporting of a Trump presidency and reflecting the experience and opinion of many of the most senior principals who served in the final year of his administration. They divulged, some for the very first time, what they witnessed firsthand to tell the truth about this extraordinary years for the benefit of history. As with a very stable genius, the title of this book borrowed Trump's own word. On July 21st, 2016, when he accepted the Republican president nomination in Cleveland, Trump vowed, "I alone can fix it." He offered himself to the forgotten men and women of America as their sole hope for redemption, and as president, he was powered by solipsism. He governed to protect and promote himself. "I alone can fix it," was the tenet by which he led. What followed is the story of Trump's final years on office, told from the inside. Some events have indelibly marked our nation's collective memory. Many behind-the-scenes episodes have never been reported until now. Some moments show perseverance and resilience. Others expose cowardice and cluelessness. It is an attempt to make sense of a year of crisis, at the heart of which was leadership vacuum. It is the story of how Trump tested the republic, twisting the country institution for personal gain, and then pushing his followers to fall. And it is the story of how voters, both fearful for their own futures and their country, finally discharged him.